This is, in many cases, a very intentional effort to have high teacher turnover. And whether it's intentional or not, it is absolutely the result of policy choices that could be different.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how the recent wage increase for the teachers in the state of Alabama actually decreased retirements from the record high the year before. And with that, I think that there is a clear path forward for addressing the teacher shortage in the state of Alabama, which would be higher wages for teachers, more freedom for the teachers to teach, less restriction on their ability to teach, smaller classroom sizes, better working conditions, because this seems to be what has worked. We've offered a pretty substantial raise to people who have been there a long time. And what happened? We saw retirements decrease this year from the record high the year before, when they were projected to be even higher than last year before this wage increase. So we've got a clear and proven method to retain talent in the teaching industry and bring in more talent and attract talent. So naturally, the Alabama State Board of Education is lowering standard for certifying teachers to address the teacher shortage, as opposed to improving working conditions, as opposed to raising wages, as opposed to decreasing classroom sizes, as opposed to making better working conditions. They're lowering standards for certifying teachers.
It is the easier thing to do. Certainly the easier thing to do. And I'm just going to pick up here, Jacob, if that's okay.
Yeah.
They've been talking about doing this for a little while now. They did finally do it at the Alabama Board of Education meeting this week. But it's worth pointing out that on July 5th, there was a report from the Alabama Commission on the Evaluation of Services. And in a July 12th article for AL.com, Rebecca Griesbach shared that the report, quote, criticized several aspects of statewide plans to address teacher shortages, noting high turnover rates, a failure to measure outcomes of costly campaigns, and troubling trends in teacher licensing. So it's interesting that here we are, roughly within a week or two of each other, this report comes out verifying what common sense would tell you, which is some of the things Alabama has tried for this teacher shortage is not particularly effective and is not even being really monitored for effectiveness. And the trends in teacher licensing and lowering the standards for entering the teaching profession is, causing some concerns about just the degree of professionalization, or in this case, deprofessionalization that's happening with teachers. And I know you wanted my perspective on this because I am a former educator and I am a former staffer for AEA. So I've dealt with public education in different capacities. So to bring some nuance to it, I'll say this. The lowering of the standards that Jacob reported on, that you've probably seen in the news this week, it's not quite as bad as the headlines may make it out to be. There are basically they're giving some wiggle room for folks who are kind of right there on the edge of getting their certification, but are a few points shy of passing something called the Praxis exam. Everyone has to pass this Praxis exam in order to become a certified teacher in the state of Alabama. And so they are trying to lower the score thresholds for certain folks if they have other ways to kind of compensate for that with, say, their GPA in college, for example. So that's not quite as bad as it may sound. And on that note, I will also just add that the Praxis exam is not necessarily a reflection of your capacity to be a good teacher. You can make a perfect score on that test, but that doesn't mean you know how to deliver instruction to a room full of 12-year-olds. It doesn't mean you know how to manage a classroom or write engaging lessons or assess your students' progress. It just means that you are really good at a test. And I think we do have to take a step back and ask ourselves in the education community, why is it that we allow a multiple choice test by the Pearson Corporation to be a determinant of whether or not someone should be a teacher? I think there are better measures and there are more holistic approaches we can take. All that said, the fact that Alabama is responding to this teacher shortage that we hear about on the news at this point, it seems like every week, the fact that their most high profile response right now is to lower the standards to entry is pretty absurd on its face. And I think if you would consider most any other profession and compare it, you would see that, right? I mean, if we know there's a shortage of airline pilots right now, but my guess is most of us would not want the standards lowered to become a pilot, right? I don't want to make it to where folks who currently are failing their pilots exams can be just passed on through. If I have a doctor who's about to operate on me, I'd like to know that they actually met their requirements and graduated from medical school and got their medical license through some degree of competency, and not just because the scores were lowered. The score thresholds were lowered just because they were that desperate to get warm bodies in the positions. So there is some nuance there, but again, Alabama lowering the barriers to entry, this is not the first time they've done this. Over the years, we've seen multiple attempts to more or less deprofessionalize the profession, whether it's rules about quote unquote adjunct instructors that were implemented a few years ago, or whether it's this in terms of lowering the Praxis scores. This is an ongoing effort. And I think it is troubling because the same folks who are pushing these sort of measures are also the exact same folks demanding more accountability for teachers and proclaiming teachers to be, overpaid, lazy government employees who are harming your children, right? So there are all these bad things, but no one wants to be one of those. Surprise, surprise. I guess, no one wants to jump into the fire and be demonized as a child groomer and as a lazy government worker. So they demand more accountability on one hand while lowering the standards for entry on the other. And this contradiction is not going to improve instruction for students, and it's certainly not going to improve the teacher turnover rate. We have pretty clear ideas about what can help with that. You mentioned some of them, Jacob, in terms of better pay, better retirement benefits, better working conditions. And that's the thing that really gets lost in this conversation, even with a decent pay raise that was passed this past legislative session, particularly up in the higher years of experience. They did reform the salary matrix. There is improvement. So while some folks are only seeing a 4% pay raise, some folks are seeing 10, 15, up to 20%. That's significant. That actually outpaces inflation, which many folks are not getting raises that will do that.
Right.
But the bigger issue is the way in which working conditions are not being addressed. And frankly, you're not even hearing that from AEA either. I know right-wing media would have you believe that they are like this all-powerful, shadowy leftist group pulling all the strings and running our schools. But that only exists in the right-wing imagination. I can promise you that. If you don't believe me, as a former staffer and a former teacher, go talk to any rank and file teacher. If you can find me 1 out of 10 who could name you a single official with AEA or NEA, I would be shocked.
Right.
Or if they could tell you a single proposal that either of these organizations are pushing beyond improve the budget, improve pay, and keep things from getting worse. That is the A, B, and C of the legislative agenda for the education community in this state. And while there's certainly merit to that, because we do need more funding and we do need better pay, and we certainly don't want to make things worse with more privatization and attacks on public schools, it's clearly not sufficient. Because when you talk to teachers, it's the working conditions that are typically going to be first on their mind. The ability to go to the bathroom, it's things that basic. The ability to use the classroom supply money that the state appropriates to them. The ability to use that money when they actually need it, and not just when some school district CFO decides they feel like releasing it to them and feel like taking it back. It's the lack of planning time. In the state of Alabama, teachers are only guaranteed 30 minutes in their workday free of instruction or supervision. And that time is frequently abused because there's no penalty in the law for school districts abusing it. And notice I said free from instruction or supervision. It doesn't even guarantee that you have that time to plan your lessons and to call parents and to grade papers. Because if some jackass principal or HR director or central office bureaucrat decides that you need to sit in a meeting every single day during your planning period, they'll just do that because they can.
Right.
And we're not addressing class size limits. There are no class size limits in the state of Alabama. There are only recommendations. And you can guess how far those carry weight when there's no teeth to it.
Right.
Research is very clear on how class size impacts achievement and how it impacts teacher retention and turnover. So we need conversations around real class size limits with actual enforceable mechanisms. We need conversations about expansion of planning time and prep time so that teachers have the time to do their job instead of relying on unpaid hours outside of their contract, which is the current system. We need to talk about paid maternity leave. Because yes, teachers have sick leave, but you're talking about an overwhelmingly female profession and you don't even have maternity leave in 2022. It's absurd.
Right. Yeah.
And the big elephant in the room is that students all over the state of Alabama are coming to us from poverty. They're coming to us with incarcerated parents, with no parents, with drug addicted parents. Our public schools are just a reflection of the neighborhoods and communities outside of them. And so the issues that we have in Alabama in terms of our quality of life, the lack of health care, the lack of good employment options, the spread of drug addiction, mental illness with no mental health treatment available, mass incarceration, racism, and other forms of bigotry. These are absolutely reflected in our public schools and in the lackluster results of public school achievement. And teachers can't fix that by themselves. There are things that we can do inside of our schools to deal with those socioeconomic obstacles, but it requires funding and it requires actual prioritization. You have to make it a priority. So I think those are some of the issues that are being lost in this conversation. It goes well beyond whether or not we should lower or raise the score on a multiple choice test to whether you can be a teacher. And it even goes beyond salary, as important as that is, because even with these pay raises, teachers are still underpaid compared to similarly educated professionals, right? You have to go to college. You have to get a college degree. You have to have an internship, an entire semester of internship that is unpaid. Let me tell you, that's not fun. Right. To basically have a full-time job that is unpaid and still try to pay your bills. The only way you do that is student loans for most folks. In Alabama, you don't see them talking about forgiving student loans for teachers, not on any kind of massive scale. You don't see them putting a moratorium on the privatization of support staff. Because who wants to be a special education teacher when you know when you walk in the room, you're not going to have the adults there that you need, that your students are required to have by federal law? Why? Because, well, who's going to go work for a temp agency for $13 an hour with no benefits, no retirement, no due process, no union, nothing but $13 an hour to be a special education aide, doing some of the most difficult work in a public school? So those are just some of the thoughts that I have about Alabama's lackluster response to the teacher shortage.
And I mean, it really is indicative of the lack of, I was going to say lack of imagination, but lack of actual interest in addressing the problem. That instead of doing any of these number of things, continuing on this path that we have shown just within the last year with the wage increases, that a lot of these, the ones at the bottom of the pay scale, their raises didn't quite match inflation, but the ones at the top of the pay scale, the ones who've been there for 20 years or so, they way outpaced inflation. And we saw a decrease in retirements,
right?
A marked decrease in retirements from the year before. And so we've got this tried and true method to address the teacher shortage in Alabama. And there's just not any interest in continuing down this road, because that would entail some amount of actual investment, some amount of it's bizarre. But we do have $400 million to build a new prison.
Right. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there are very wealthy, powerful interests who want to see public education fail.
Right.
And a high teacher turnover rate advances that mission. So, make no mistake, this is not by accident. This is, in many cases, a very intentional effort to have high teacher turnover. And whether it's intentional or not, it is absolutely the result of policy choices. Right. Policy choices that could be different.
Yeah. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.